If you've ever lived or even passed through New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, particularly the Philadelphia metropolitan area, chances are that you've heard of Wawa. Wawa is a privately held, family-owned chain of convenience stores operating along the East Coast, and it's been around for the last, 60 years or so, maybe even more, but our guest will tell us more about that. Today, we know the brand for their hoagies and their sandwiches, and we know them for their gas stations, but most importantly, we know Wawa for the warm, welcoming feeling that you get when you enter any of their stores. And that level of consistency is never an accident. And so whenever I run into any kind of a place where I see that kind of consistency, it always makes me curious to know, what's going on there with their company's culture that makes all of this possible? Well, in today's episode of Culture Architects, we get our answers from the CEO of Wawa himself, Chris Gheysens. Chris started out with Wawa in 1997 as the company's CFO and later became the CEO back around 2012. And under his leadership, Wawa has steadily grown and maintained its ranking as one of America's largest private companies. But he's always attributed their success to their culture. And today we're setting out to know how and why. So Chris, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thank you, David. Really glad to be here.
It's just going to be a really fun conversation. And again, I'm such a huge Wawa fan. So I love going into a Wawa. I love buying things there. And so this is going to be really fun to learn more about it. So for a background standpoint, you have a background that's a little unusual to be, such a culture champion and architect. You have a background, as you had shared with me once before, as a finance guy in accounting. So how did you go from being an accountant to, first of all, to even working for Wawa? Give us that little background. And then I'm curious about how this all works.
Well, look, accountants have hearts too. There is an urban legend out there. So so I graduated Villanova University here locally in the Philadelphia area, not far from where our corporate headquarters are. And I worked for a big six firm at the time, shows my age a little bit because there's only big four now, and at Deloitte. And I remember a mentor there. I said, look, I'm entering my first year with about 30 other first years. What do I do to set myself apart, or give me any tips? And he said, look, go make friends with the scheduler, because she's the one that basically assigns the clients for the first years. I did that. And she gave me great advice. She said, look, this Wawa client. I said, I know Wawa. I didn't know it was a client. We send people out there every year for the audit. We're going to put you on that client. And I went out there and fell in love with it. That was my first experience with Wawa back in 93 after I graduated Villanova. And so I was an accountant by trade, and I worked on sort of the other side of the fence for a number of years with Deloitte. But immediately, especially comparing and contrasting against other clients I had a lot in retail, recognized there was something special and different about this thing. We all knew as Wawa as a place to go and get a sandwich or coffee, as you said, but being on the inside just felt something different. And I joined Wawa in 97.
So
and been here ever since.
What is it that, can you identify, what did you notice? So it was different. There's a different feeling here. There's a different way of being. What were some of the things they did differently that caused you to say, this is unusual?
There was a sense of, even as an outsider, and let's face it, I was an auditor, and auditors don't arrive on scene, especially external auditors, as the most embraced and beloved. And
great, the auditors are coming today.
The accounting team at Wawa wasn't cheering the day they got up and knowing the auditors were arriving. So, but yet they made me feel that way. That's what primarily was different. I wasn't a burden, or the team at Deloitte wasn't a burden. We were embraced. There was a collegiality that you saw and felt in your one-on-one interactions and in the hallway, and just the sense that they cared. They cared a little bit more in their commitment to the business. They cared a little bit more about their customers. They cared a little bit more about each other. And even as an outsider, I got that sense early on in their interactions with me and what I observed clearly early on.
It's interesting. I think back to my entire career, my first career in the insurance industry and the second career, and I think about all the different companies we've worked with, and I always see this consistency that the way a company deals with its customers is usually consistent with the way they deal with each other and the way they deal with vendors and suppliers. Like, it's rare to find a company that's really deep into customer service and treats their vendors like crap.
Yeah.
It's more of a pervasive way of looking at the world, I think.
I think that's right. And in our case, as I've learned since then, it's grounded in values, the values that, underpin the individuals here, the leaders before me, and underpin our culture.
Yeah. So I saw in one of the interviews that you had done at one point, you talked about, or you described Wawa's culture as kind of like a melting pot of the Wood family values, which are the original family, and the Quaker roots of the company, and sort of the way that the Philly area works, because it is a Philly-based company. So tell me more about that. How did that evolve?
Yeah. And I still think that's accurate. I'm looking here in front of me, column 1. This is put out by a former CEO, really our iconic CEO and leader family member, Dick Wood. This is in the mid-'80s. And he sort of lists some of the challenges in the business at the time, but then runs through his laundry list, as he said, of random thoughts about the environment of our company. And by environment, it was just a different word for culture. And people like me have this printed out and on their desk all over this building,
really,
in many of our stores. And it's for those that, not me, but others that were actually here at the time, they also would agree that it was that authenticity that came through from Dick around these things. And I share that because there's still a big part of our culture. There's a lot of things in here that say a disdain for flash, that there's much more about humility, about low ego. It's organization and associate first, and not, leaders' ego that drives the agenda or the moment. It talks about the most important person in the company is the one ringing the cash register, not the one sitting in the seat I'm in right now. So there are a lot of that Quaker and Wood family heritage and values coming through. As Quakers, certainly this idea of consensus driven, very important. Some might get a little from the outside, new to Wawa, or even an external vendor might say, boy, you guys operate a little slower than I would think as a retailer. It's because everyone has a say. We're very consensus driven, but when we get to that goal line, we know that everyone's there with us to go over it. So, and humility plays a really big part, really big part in our leaders. It's still a big part of what we call our servant leadership. Not a word we use that Dick used back then in the mid-'80s, but we've adopted and used, and actually have a servant leadership training center here on campus.
Wow.
But, I would say that's a big element and foundation. But growing up in Philadelphia, I think my view of culture is you are a melting pot. You embody all of the influences in some way, shape, or form that come into you. And Philadelphia has a certain grittiness to it. It has a certain hustle to it. It has a certain neighborhoody feeling to it that shines through. And you go into different Wawas, whether it's in Delaware County, where I'm sitting now, or in Northeast Philadelphia, each of them has a tiny bit of a different personality that's really a reflection, I think, of the community that they're in. And that's because people in that community shop, they call it their Wawa. It was actually a tagline of ours for years from customers of my Wawa, because that's how they referred to it, my Wawa. And that's not always done in retail. So there's certainly this element of my Wawa that comes through from the community and the neighborhoods we serve. And that's, I just read something today where someone talked about this idea that we don't put in automatic doors in our stores, that you have to manually open the door. And when you're walking out with a bag of goods or products, sometimes that's not easy. And the reality is it's because people love to hold the doors just a little bit longer for their fellow customer when they walk or leave inside or outside of a Wawa. And that's really something that came from Philadelphia. As gritty as the town is, we grew up here. And I've always wanted to measure this, David. It's maybe put that in the finance accounting side of me of, is that reality true? And our engineers, our operating engineers, have gone out in the years past. We get an extra step or two versus other retailers where people will hold the door because, again, it's a part of that culture that's come on through the communities that we serve.
It's really interesting. I never thought about that, but I think when you're in an environment where people are friendly, you feel better, you feel more comfortable, and you do tend to want to reciprocate in some way. And so it makes sense to me that if I'm walking into a Wawa and everybody's friendly and people are smiling and the associate, you refer to them as associates? The associates
yes,
are warm and making you feel like they're glad you're there. Yeah, you would want to hold the door open a little longer for someone coming in because you just feel like I'm in this community of people who behave in a certain kind of way.
That's right. That too. And what I say is typically Wawa's, because we're so dense, it's a pretty tight trade area. The odds are you're at the coffee island in the morning, preparing your coffee. You're rubbing elbows with someone you might not know exactly, or you might know very well, but you might see him at church, or you might see him on the soccer field, or you might see him later at a school meeting, or they might be a teacher for your child. The community's pretty tight at the end of the day. And I think there's this town square, town hall type feel to it that there's a little bit of a higher calling of, maybe I need to be in my best. I'm going to show up to Wawa, maybe in my pajamas today, because that's the way I want to arrive. We are comfortable and welcoming, but I'm going to be a little nicer because these are people that are really down the street from where I live or work or play type of thing.
Yeah. Now, as I'm thinking about as our audience listens to this conversation and what you and I have just been talking about, there may be a mistake on audience part of thinking this is this small little, local cozy kind of thing. So share with our audience, like, how many associates do you have and how many locations do you have?
Yeah. As we record this, we have just over 48,000 Wawa associates. Wow. We have just over 1,100 stores. They're all company owned and operated. And your average Wawa is a bit different than maybe your average convenience store. For us, our store size is about 6,500 square feet. Your average convenience store in the industry is maybe about 2,000 square feet. So a much larger box. We're really known for our fresh food and drinks. So we compete in #1 in market share in drip coffee. We compete with a Starbucks, just a different price point for espresso-based drinks and things like that, milkshakes they call frappuccinos. And yet we're known for our hoagies. We're known for our breakfast sandwiches. So we would, to give you just a sense of scale, sell more in food than your average McDonald's. And McDonald's in a consideration set would be the #1 consideration if I'm not going to go to a Wawa. So, think of Dunkin' for coffee and Starbucks, think of McDonald's and Wendy's and Chick-fil-A for lunch. We're competing across all those day parts. And then there's the gasoline part. We would sell more gas per site than really almost anyone in the country. We're a really high volume retailer, and we look to democratize just a slightly better experience when people are on their way between point A and point B. We want that stop in the middle, that in between, to be the most cherished few minutes of their day, because we recognize and respect the time crunch that everyone in society is under. And we know that going from point A to point B might not be the best place in the world, or point A where you came from might not be the best thing. And we just want to make sure that we try to give you that little, as you said, comfortable, warm, welcome everybody in a spot where you can just feel at ease for a few minutes.
So, it's such a cool thing. And again, easy to do if you have one location or two locations and everybody's in the same building and we can convey the culture that we want to all of these people. Yeah. But that's a completely different task or challenge to have 48,000 associates and try to create a reasonably consistent experience so that anywhere that I go to a Wawa in the country, I know that I'm going to have this positive experience. How do you pull that off?
Yeah. It's hard. Let's make no mistake. And I'm too much of a pragmatist to sit here and tell you we get it perfect 2 million times a day. We see about 2 million customers a day.
2 million, wow.
But our store associates, there's a lot to it. And as much as I've tried to wrap my mind around the answer to a question that I've been asked a million times, there's so many components. So one, I think it starts with a business strategy of consistency. Our strategy of, if you go into a Wawa in New Jersey or Virginia or Florida or now Ohio, there's a certain consistency and reliability that we want in the customer service and the offer. A hoagie is going to taste the same in Ohio as it does in Florida, as it does in New Jersey. And yes, we understand there's difference in water and bread and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it starts there with that promise, and that promise carries over to a service and a culture which is tied to it. So we do a bunch around it. One, we celebrate, talk about, and reward our associates around culture all the time. It's catching associates in the moment of truth, as we like to say. I do a weekly You Rock award on video for the company of simply one of the dozens of letters or emails that I get about unique things that our associates are doing to live the culture. Really, customers might not call it that, but it's really what it is. Two, we have leaders that are really across the board more tenured than most retailers because we're partially employee owned. We're actually, our largest shareholders, our employees as a group, our associates own almost 40% of the company. So they're owners. It's more than a job. It's carrying a culture and a service and doing a great thing today because it's going to take care of me as an owner long term. And then we try to really invest in unique ways. We have training. Certainly that's important, but training isn't always the culture answer. It's a way to get consistency, but you have to be clear around that culture expectation. So for example, we've just opened in Indiana and Ohio, new markets, a big leap for us. And the way that we get culture implanted is we really seek out and ask some of our best cultural ambassador leaders of stores, people leaders, and they move. And they've moved permanently in many cases to these new markets to set up shop for us. The leader and then the leadership team in the first handful of stores in new markets will really be people that have known our culture. And so that's a critical moment for us to help embed culture in a new store and a new geography. But boy, there's so many institutions that we have, so many different ways that we recognize and not really just reward, but reinforce culture. Our internal care team, for an example, our culture, I think, is, we look at it as almost two dichotomies. We highly care about our people and we're results oriented, which can be a conflicting culture at times. We have an internal care team that reports directly to me, about a dozen associates, social workers and others that just take care of our associates when they hit a road bump in life. That is a huge cultural thing to put forward. It reports directly to the CEO, and it's a team that is there to celebrate your great times in life, a marriage, a birth of a new child, but is also there to help maybe with an unexpected death, even if it's a financial assistance. So there's lots of things we do to just reinforce culture, and probably some of them work and probably some of them don't. And that's the challenge. It's like advertising. You know that half of it works and half of it doesn't. You just don't know which half is which.
Yeah. When I think about companies in retail, particularly, who appear to do quite an extraordinary job at this and finding the right balance between people first and results, I think of Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
Clearly they outdo everybody in that end of the fast food chain, competition. Yeah. And at the same time, they're clearly people first and create a different experience for people. And when I've spoken to people at Chick-fil-A before, I've always had the impression that they're very picky about who they hire, that they're really, they will turn down an awful lot of candidates at every level before hiring the right people. So I'm curious, where Wawa is on that. Like, how do you go about, not you specifically, but the organization, how does the organization go about hiring and specifically finding people who are going to thrive in the Wawa culture?
Yeah, so I think it's best to maybe break up the groups, if you will, although we don't think of it that way internally, but at store level, in the simplest way, we're hiring for smiles and attitude, and we can train the rest usually. It depends on the role in the stores. But the store team, and similarly the corporate team, if someone joins that's really not a part of the culture, and that can be dangerous, but not a part of the culture here is strong enough that it's going to eject that person. It's going to be organ rejection. Right. But at store level, we do have some surveys, questionnaires, online documents that everyone fills out that helps give us a sense of their aptitude around service, friendliness, and connection. That's really where we start at store level. Similarly here in our corporate office, even at very senior levels, I'm in the process of hiring a very senior level individual. we put them through a cultural screen with behavioral scientists, to be honest.
Wow.
So we get under the covers pretty significantly. They'll spend a day with them to understand. Interviews are an element of it. And our interviews, by the way, there's a lot. So right now, as I'm doing this, we have an executive that's in stores as part of the interview process, touring and with a senior store person. It is, to us and me, one of the most telling things when you put a senior executive into a store environment. Who are they comfortable talking with? How do they engage associates at very different levels? One of the things I say, borrowed from Jay Wright of Villanova basketball, is our status is the same, even though our roles might be different. And so all of that needs to come out, and we will have the team that will report to the individual actually as part of the interview process. And to say, is this someone that I would follow behind, and not someone that has to earn my followership, but do I get the sense that they have the culture and the values and the attributes to get that? So for us, it's a really important process. Now in retail, it's difficult. We have the best in class retail turnover, which is one measure. A lot don't measure retention. So sometimes there's a small group that rotates a little bit further. We're now looking at retention and making sure that we're retaining our most beloved, if you will, associates that have been here the longest, that understand our culture the most, because that's really the center of our culture in our stores. The handful of associates that, maybe a general manager will come and go in a store because they're looking to get promoted and moving on to a different store that needs assistance. There's usually a handful of associates in a store that are there for 20, 30 years. Wow. They're the ones that anchor that store and the culture in it. And they're the ones we want to make sure that we're keeping, we're engaging with, and we're retaining over the long term.
When you hire somebody, there's in our 8-step framework that we talk about, and for how do you intentionally build a culture, the fourth of those steps is, we call it integration, which is what some people call orientation. It's the process by which you take those people you just hired, they made it through the interview process, and now you're indoctrinating them into the Wawa way. So what does that look? I'm sure it's different at the store level than corporate level, but if I were, let's say I'm at the store level and I just got hired, how do I learn the Wawa way of doing things?
The first, so you're trying to engage and train for skills as well as to share exactly what you say, the Wawa way. So a few things. One, believe it or not, there is the Wawa way, and then there's Lessons from the Flock, 2 books that my predecessor has written. What I find, David, is fascinating, especially when we go into new markets, is even a customer service associate, a cashier, will say, boy, I've read the books about your company. I wanted to know what type of company you are and how you treat your people. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm interviewing. That's why I've joined the company. So there's a little bit of a built-in start, but not good enough. Not everyone's certainly doing that. We've adjusted our onboarding process to be both skills-based and as well to give a heavy dose of what our culture is and some of the expectations. There's some vignettes in there. I'm sadly in there still, but many leaders, just to try to give a sense of what our culture is about. At store level, I know they do a really good job of connecting new hires with those sort of core long-term associates in the stores. Maybe they don't have a direct role in training how to do X, Y, or Z. They have a very direct role in espousing what we're about, espousing that ownership culture, espousing what it means to work at Wawa. So it's a little bit of art, a little bit of training and science, but it's a heavy dose of art inside of the store. We get it right, I think, often, not always, but we get it right often. Here at corporate, we've figured a pretty robust system focused at, no matter which role you're on. Orientation, for example, I just witnessed this morning. Orientation stopped on Mondays. We have our new hire orientation for the week or every 2 weeks. There was about a dozen people. They stop at the coffee island. We have coffee in different parts, as you would imagine, our corporate office, and they teach them how to make coffee. And why is that? Because one, everyone at store level knows how to do it. And it says store support center at the front of our building, not corporate office or things like that. And by the way, the expectation is there's a hustle and ownership and take ownership mentality here. When you go to the coffee island, on your second day of work here and the regular coffee is out, don't just take another flavor and move on. Fill the regular coffee. Mm-hmm. I've been late for meetings here more often than not because the coffee is empty. And if I'm the last one, I'm making coffee again.
Wow.
You don't know how many people who I've seen there that are new to Wawa say, wow, the CEO knows how to make coffee. Like, of course, by the way, make it at home too.
Not only knows, but takes responsibility for it.
Yes. So it's some of those little things carry much more water and weight when you're describing your culture and orientation than almost anything you can put in a video or on a piece of paper. So we try to do those things and then assign a cultural buddy to everyone who's starting here that really has an understanding, because I think as good as we are and as rich and strong as our culture is, and the work that you do, I'm learning, we have not clarified it in behaviors effectively enough. I think and it's one of the things that I'm taking on and trying to do more of.
Yeah. So you had told me when you and I had breakfast together, you were telling me about that there are some places, I think you were telling me a story about in Florida, perhaps it was, where your expansion, your pace of expansion was perhaps, these are my words, but was perhaps outpacing how well you were indoctrinating the culture, and caused you to say, we got to pull back a little bit and slow down. And I found that really fascinating that, we talk about this dichotomy you were describing between results and growth and our culture, that you were willing to slow down that growth in order to kind of retrench and make sure we get the culture right. So talk to me about why that's so important.
Look, culture is our biggest competitive weapon. I'd love to tell you we sell some highly unique product and service that you can't get at one of the other 154,000 convenience stores or 18,000 McDonald's or Starbucks or Dunkin'. What we sell is an experience and a promise, and it starts with a relationship between a customer service associate and a customer. And meeting that promise, we expect to give them clean, fast, fresh, friendly, and maybe we overemphasize friendly. Yes, and I don't. My marketing team, if they heard this, would say, "Hold on, we do have great products. Yes, we have great products at a great price. Of course, there's the pitch." But at the end of the day, we're only going to be as good as each of the customers. We don't really talk about total sales here. We don't talk about total customer count. I threw out earlier 2 million customers a day. No one cares when they go up to the coffee counter or at the register or they're waiting for a sandwich to be made that we serve 2 million customers a day. They care about that moment and how they were treated. And that's what we talk about, these moments of truth. So, we weren't really good, I would say a decade ago plus, when we went into Florida, about measuring culture. We were using really engagement surveys as a proxy. And I think at best they're a loose proxy for that. But what we do in our culture is we're very high touch. Our leadership, our senior leaders, and really the top 50 leaders are in stores often. And there was just a constant feedback, self-observed, as well as some of our other leaders, that one of our geographies in Florida, as we were about year 2 and starting some more aggressive growth, it was suffering from a culture perspective. And David, I couldn't point to an exact conversation, but it was just the way you were interacting with leaders when you were in the stores and associates, and some of the words and phrases they were using, the feelings they were having, the engagement. Then we would talk to some customers through customer research, and also some of the customer. I believe culture and our culture and our service are really tightly linked. And so when you see culture start to have some challenges, a lagging indicator is going to be, you're going to start to see it in service indicators. Some of the service indicators weren't bad, but just started to show maybe some cracks. There was one leader who finally came back and said, we have some issues here. So we put ourselves together in a room. We sort of figured out where we were. We got some more data points, and we made a call that wasn't beloved, because there's a machine that is opening stores and staffing stores, and there's a financial projections. And we said, we are going to slow down dramatically. We put stores on hold. We went and did some what I would call people work down there, and we found that there were some leaders who we had promoted probably a little early and really weren't ready for the challenge. And And we had to retrench with them, and they were exhibiting some leadership because of those, their ineffectiveness, exhibiting some behaviors that were trickling down to the team that was in some senior roles, some store leader roles. And so we just had to do a little HR triage, develop and coach, replace some leaders at that point. And honestly, as tough of a decision that was, it had a financial impact. It was exactly the right decision because we were still in the first impression mode. We were still getting awareness and building trial for the first time in new towns in and around that area of Florida. And if you miss them on the first try, if you have a brand promise that says we're this, and you arrive here, that doesn't fly. And so it was a telling one. It's a story I've told often because I think in hindsight, we did the right thing, as tough as it was in the moment. We weren't sure, but it felt like the right thing. And if you're going to make a mistake, err on the side of the customer, err on the side of your culture. We're a private company. It doesn't mean we don't have aggressive financial targets. It was the right side to take at that point and pay dividends.
Yeah. And I think, it's a great example because I think that where you really understand a company's culture often is when decisions have to be made. It's easy when things are easy, but when we come to a point where we have to go this direction or that direction, which one do you go down? Well, that tells you a lot about what the culture is here. Or your willingness to say, yes, the financial results are really, really important to us, and we still got to get this thing right, and this is going to trump the rest. That sends a pretty loud message, clear message to everybody.
It does. David, I have a great story that was super impactful to me because I was in a small room on that point years ago. And I don't think I was CFO at the time, but in the board setting, our chairman was discussing the then CEO's performance that year, and just talking about some of the things that he had accomplished. That year in particular was a really tough financial year for us at the beginning of the year. And we did some, what I recall as amazing pivots to really change tactics to really win the year financially. I thought for sure the chairman was going to say, boy, the CEO and the senior leadership team nailed it financially. He barely hit that point. Instead, he said the greatest accomplishment that the CEO had, not just maybe in that year, but in his career, was the creation of what I talked about earlier, this internal care team that we had benchmarked with some other companies, learned what they did, and then we instituted and implemented this in a much grander scale. And he said, if there's anything more relevant and needed around our culture is trying to support our associates because we're people first. And, I'm paraphrasing his words.
Right.
And I still remember the emotion I had around that. It was super impactful to say our board of directors, who's all about governance and financials and supposed to hit numbers and long-range plan and strategy, they were celebrating someone for overshadowing his great financial performance and looking at something that was a core and has become a core, cultural institution for us.
Wow.
That's one of those moments where I said, wow, I am in the right place and my values are aligned with certainly the values of this board.
I'll tell you just a quick story of the opposite of that. So I was talking to, and this will kind of get you, I was talking to a bank in the Midwest who will remain unnamed, but I was talking to a bank in the Midwest, and this bank was making lots of acquisitions of community banks and putting them together. And I had been referred to a person who was sort of a regional director of 5 or 6 of those regional banks, and she had heard about the work that we do, and she was really interested in implementing what we teach people to really be much more purposeful about their culture. But she needed to go to the CEO of the big bank in order to get permission to do that. And when she went to the CEO, he told her, "We're too busy for that stuff. We're making all these acquisitions. We don't have time to work on that stuff." And I think about the difference between that and your description of what the board is saying in that instance.
Yeah. That's, acquisitions come with a lot of cultural risk, probably more than business risk.
Yeah,
so,
you would think
that's surprising to hear.
It ought to be their most important thing they're doing.
Yes, you would think.
So you told me that, and this is sort of a little self-evident what you've described, but I heard you say to me previously that as a CEO of a 48,000 associate company, your number one priority is your culture.
Mm.
Why?
Yep. I think it's everything that makes us special. I think one, I'm in the role I'm in because the culture here really aligns with my own culture and personal values, but it's because I believe it in my heart. It's so important. People aren't going to remember the financial success they had they're going to remember how you made them feel. And so personally for me, I think what we do in the community, what we do for our associates, which is a big part of our culture, the ability to give people the opportunity for growth. I just got an email just last night from a 35-year veteran who just decided to retire a little early than he expected because he's done so well with the stock and the ownership, and he was just reflecting on his amazing career. They're the emails that I get that, make me, and I think really all the senior leaders here get up in the morning and run to work. It's not the email that says we beat budget last week or, yes, that's why we do it. And I don't say that because, we're doing so well, it's easy. It's not easy, but the reality is the culture here is the differentiator. When I get the letters, they're not, and the letters that are great from customers, it's not usually about, I love your product. Maybe it's, hey, I like going in for your hoagies, or I love your coffee. But the letters are always about a unique interaction with a customer service associate. I just had one from one of our neighbors in Moorestown. And that neighbor said that he had an issue with our Wawa mobile app and in the store and was really struggling with it. The customer service associate actually called him on his cell phone at his own, but reached out on her own to solve the problem. She thought it was one thing. She wanted to, outside the store. That's not what you get every day. And that's just one example from this weekend. So it's just really, for our perspective strategically, and I think culture and strategy do need to be linked. Service is what we're about. We're selling a product that we think has a great value proposition, but at the end of the day, the product we're selling is an interaction and experience, again, between point A and point B, where you can feel comfortable, consistent, reliable, friendly, and culture underpins all of that. So from a strategy perspective, it makes sense. From a values perspective, it makes sense. And I think it's aligned us for a very long time and will continue to around our core strategy, and that's our culture.
So we talked about the dichotomy of results versus people, and I shouldn't even say versus, but they're just two different aspects of success. So for those who would question the return on investment, you're a finance guy, so you must ask this a lot, but how do you, if at all, quantify that investment that you make in culture? Somehow that's got to come back and say we are more successful financially because of the investment we make in this. Yeah. How do you look at that as a finance guy?
We don't have any formulas or discounted cash flows on that. I will say Harvard actually came in and studied us years ago to try to get under that. This idea of culture, and in that case, even ownership, ESOP ownership. Is there a value? They concluded there wasn't a quantitative perspective necessarily, although they tried. I would tell you, from my perspective, we just look back at decisions that we've made and the continued aggregate growth of the company and the success we have. And aggregate growth just isn't financial, but it is things like engagement, lower turnover. It's things that we know have a direct and indirect value back to the owners. We have an NPS score that rivals pretty much everyone in the industry. We have a turnover that's lower than almost anyone in the industry. And by industry, I'm broadening that beyond convenience stores. We have sales per location that would be the best in class. So there's a lot of measures. And it's a little bit of chicken and egg. Is that good strategy? Is it good product? Is it good culture? It's hard. And I know when to call it quits in those analyses and just say, you got to believe. And we got to believe, and I would point to through COVID, if you think about us as a retailer and some of our starting wages during COVID, when the government started to lay on additional federal and state level unemployment benefits, you could have gotten paid actually fairly handsomely more to stay at home and receive unemployment than to work at Wawa during COVID, which we were open as an essential provider. So we had amazingly very few people, very few, I want to say like less than a dozen out of all of them quit because of that. And that was such a stressful moment for me. I remember that Monday when the extra benefits were going in thinking, oh my gosh, our store's going to be empty of associates. And when I talked to associates, I went out and talked to a lot of them. Why? They're an owner. We've treated them well. This is a place where I can grow and learn and be challenged. This is a place I love. This is family. These are my people here, my customers, my town, my fellow associates. I'm not going to leave them. That's culture in a moment where it mattered really significantly coming to life. So a lot of those moments, I think you measure and chalk up and put on the scoreboard as a cultural moment, but it's hard to say it equaled this in terms of sales or impact. So, but at the end of the day, it's what it's all about, in my opinion, because we're also fighting for talent. And, we've lost people, and I go into other retailers and they're there, and sometimes they'll know me and they'll run over to me and how can I get my job back? I want to come back because of it. And so there's a lot of moments where you're comparing and contrasting. Again, David, I don't want to tell you we're perfect or sound like the Pied Piper of culture, because we're not. But I do know that it matters. And I know I have to think about strategy. Sure, I got to think about the inner workings of our board of directors and governance, but there's not a day that goes by that I'm not thinking about culture in one way, shape, or form, either in mass across all our stores or in unique places within targeted parts of our organization.
Oh, so what's the biggest mistake you've made about culture?
Boy, I want to believe that culture's impacted and influenced by every single person, and it is. There's an outsized impact by the most senior leader.
Absolutely.
So I found that over the years that it does matter when I get in the lunchroom, go to get lunch downstairs, and how I walk through.
Yes.
I have contact lenses as a prime example. And I had an issue with my eyes for a long time. They were always red. And I finally had someone with the courage come up to me and said, "Why are you always mad?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? I think I'm pretty happy." They said, "Well, your eyes, you look like you're just..." And so literally I have special drops I take now to get the red out of my eyes. So you just have to pay attention to that. I think that's one. And then listening is the other. I think culture is a great big feedback loop all the time, unless you don't want to listen for the feedback loop. And so, I remember as a newly minted CEO, I'd been in the company almost 15 years at that point. I went and did that listening tour that we're all told we have to do. And I remember being in stores quite a bit. And in the role for a period of time, a few years before that, I was a bit more removed from the stores. So I was getting a little bit more back into the flow, but knew a lot of people. I remember I was in a store, Chesapeake, Virginia. I remember the name of the individual there, the leader. And I felt like, David, long story, I'll make short, that I just wasn't really getting the truth. I felt like I was being told what people wanted to hear. And that was not the Wawa culture as I knew it and as I had lived it. And so I pulled this leader aside in that last store and I said, "All right, what's really going on?" And I described this feeling I had to him. And I give him credit. He retired, doesn't work with us. I saw him recently. And he said to me, "Do you really want to know the truth? We're not allowed to tell you the truth anymore. That's the way we feel."
Wow.
And I said, that was as big of a shock. And there was some leaders that had run through that team that just had a different style of working. They were managing the noise coming up from the field as noise and not as real feedback and moments of truth. And I think what had happened culturally is people felt like they just couldn't speak up anymore as loudly. So I immediately, as a result, created a general manager council. This was a leader of a store, one in each of our geographies, that I had report to me. We either did virtually or in person every month, and also really frequently in between. And there was no one else in the room, just us. And nothing was recorded, nothing. And I handpicked these individuals. They weren't allowed to be picked by the leaders as the my guy or girl was in the room. So that still exists today. That was about 13 years ago we put that in place. And it's become a huge cultural piece of an element of how we listen, unfettered, unfiltered, from any stage all the way up through the CEO. Wow. So, listening for me, there's times when you don't have your ear to the ground enough. And in our culture, it's important, but really for culture in general, it's an important element to really understand credibility and listening.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Chris. I have one last question for you that I often like to ask our guests. And I'm always curious, I always think as we go through our lives, over time, we learn lots of things and we have some wisdom eventually that we may not have had many years ago. Yeah. So if you were talking to the Chris Gheysens who was graduating from Villanova, we won't tell people what year that was, but if we were talking to that Chris who was just graduating school and knowing all the things that you've learned over these years, what would be the biggest piece of advice you would give the 22-year-old Chris Gheysens?
Maybe this is why I give this advice.
Besides talk to the scheduler.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe this is why I give this advice today, because it's a little bit of looking in the mirror and projection. But any role, whether you're staff level or leadership role, in business, in politics, in anywhere, in my opinion, you have to learn the skills and have the experience and the know-how for sure. I guess leaving college, I thought that's what it was all about. I'm going to learn how to be an accountant. I'm going to learn debits and credits and financial statements and auditing. I'm going to get proficient at it, become expert, and I'll rise through the ranks. It took me a while to figure out that emotional intelligence and what some would just refer to as soft skills are more important. That's really every business, everything you do in life is really relationship-based, communication-based. Your ability to be self-aware, situationally aware, adaptable, self-regulate, understand the moment and the emotions and how you're presented and how others are receiving you. That is as important as anything I could know and understand as the competencies around being a good CEO or a good leader. So, it took me time to appreciate that. It took me quite a while to appreciate that. So I'd probably go back and give myself a little kick and a little head start on getting after that. And I think ultimately that starts with getting to know who you really are. Yes. And that does take time. You can't come out of college and just understand that. It takes time and situations and failure and know-how and being thrown into situations that are uncomfortable. So it takes time, but I would have been hopefully more aware of it early on if I had that advice.
Fascinating. Well, this has been a great conversation, Chris. I really appreciate Wawa is an amazing organization, and I know you're humble about it, but it's pretty incredible. And it's from my perspective as a culture leader and teacher, it's so fun to see somebody in your position that's as committed to culture as you are and understanding its impact. And so congratulations on what you've built.
Thank you, David. Thank you for what you do. It's been eye-opening. We've tried to describe our culture, especially with rapid growth, to really help, get people more familiar with it more quickly at all levels. And we still have good work to do. And I think the roadmap of what you do and the work that you've done has been eye-opening for us and something that's, I think, critical, because it does ultimately come down to behaviors.
It does.
Really enjoyed the conversation and everything you're doing. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.